This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. This week, Open Markets Institute Director Sally Hubbard looks at the history of monopolies in American industry and provides her thoughts on how to prevent monopoly power. She's interviewed by Bloomberg News reporter David McLaughlin.
Sally Hubbard, thank you for coming on to discuss Monopolies Suck. It's a very timely book because the issues you write about in the book, the power of dominant companies in the U.S. economy and their impact on workers and consumers and citizens is really a very hot topic in economics and policy making right now. And we'll see, but it could play a big role in the incoming Biden administration. So I thought we should begin with sort of the big picture about that you lay out in the book. I think when people hear the title, they might say, yeah, of course, no one likes monopolies, no one likes dealing with monopolies. But really, this book is about a bigger issue. You're warning about a kind of a worrying trend really across the economy that I think many people may not fully understand. So I thought you could maybe first just kind of set the scene for us and describe what you see happening.
Sure. And first, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today about this book. And thank you to C-SPAN for having me here to talk about it as well. Right. We all know that monopolies suck, right? That's not a surprise for anyone. But what's been happening over the last several decades is that our economy has been getting highly concentrated, and there's just been consolidation on an ongoing basis that's led to basically every major sector of our economy being controlled by just a few companies. So we hear a lot about the big tech monopolies, but no matter whether you're talking about tech or food or agriculture, name the industry, you're going to have a monopoly problem. And I specify in the book, I'm talking about monopolies, but I'm also talking about what are called duopolies, where we have two companies that rule an industry, and oligopolies, when you have three companies or a few companies that rule an industry, because basically you do not have robust competition when you have only a few players. And there are a whole lot of harms that flow from this that I wanted to highlight to readers to let them understand what it means for their everyday life and how it affects them and underlies a lot of their pain points that they experience on a daily basis.
Right. So it is, as you write about across the economy, it's our cable service, of course, the tech companies, but also in healthcare, airlines, many industries. Can you sort of talk about how we got to this point? You sort of explain in the book that there was this revolution in economic thinking several decades ago around competition. Can you explain just how we got to this point in the economy?
Sure. So, these antitrust laws that we have in the United States have been around for a very long time. The main law is called the Sherman Act, and that was passed back in 1898. And we had some pretty good antitrust enforcement for many decades. We had, a pretty deconcentrated economy for a large part of our history, after we overcame the first Gilded Age. And really, it started to get rolled back around the early 80s. It was the rise of the Chicago School of Economics, which is also known as neoliberalism. And the kind of the takeover of antitrust law to change what it's supposed to be focusing on. So antitrust law is really supposed to promote competition in open markets. It's all about making sure we don't have concentrated power, making sure the markets are functioning freely. But what the Chicago School of Economics did was say, really all we care about are making sure that corporations are efficient. And if corporations are efficient, they're going to pass on these efficiencies to consumers in the form of lower prices. Consumers are going to benefit. And so that's going to be what we look at when we're deciding whether any company is violating the antitrust laws, by either, acquiring a company that it shouldn't acquire or behaving in an anti-competitive manner to exclude competition. The test is going to be, will this be efficient? And will that, lead to lower prices for consumers? And unfortunately, all these years later, we found that this focus on efficiency has not, in fact, led to lower prices for consumers. What it's done is it's justified every kind of anti-competitive behavior and acquisition as, making that basically bigger is better, and that these corporations become these streamlined, efficient machines by getting bigger and bigger. But actually, no one is really benefiting from this. Consumers aren't benefiting from it. The only people who are really benefiting from these, supersizing of our corporations are really the C-suite executives and the major shareholders. So that's kind of how we got where we are. The antitrust laws got very weakened by the courts as the courts adopted this thinking of the Chicago School of Economics and really rolled back the way that the antitrust laws were being enforced.
Right. So the Chicago School took over a lot of thinking, even during Democratic administrations, certainly during Republican administrations. But right now, what I think is interesting is that there's a bit of a counter-revolution going on that's taken over in the last few years. I do notice on the bookshelf behind you, you have a number of books about this issue: Break them up, Monopolies. So, and your book, of course. And so I wonder if you could explain a little bit about this pushback that's cropped up, because I'll let you weigh in, but I think in the last probably, just 3 or 4 years, it's very recent that there's been a real pushback that's actually created some momentum in the other direction. That's
right. The authors of these books are all my friends in the anti-monopoly movement. We're a small but mighty movement. We are not huge and well-resourced, despite some articles that have come out recently claiming that. But I really have to give credit to the organization where I work now, the Open Markets Institute. It's been at this for, the executive director, Barry Lynn, has been at this for a long time. Back in 2005, I believe it was, he wrote his book called The End of the Line, where he was predicting that we would have shortages in the event of a pandemic because of the consolidation of supply chains. And he started the Open Markets Institute. First, it was at New America Foundation, but when they put out a statement criticizing Google, they were ousted from the New America Foundation, which was partly funded by Google. And they've been at it for, like I said, the better part of a decade. And finally, it's reached more people. People are being able to see the problems that we've been seeing for a long time. I personally have been in the antitrust field, a very long time, I guess 15 years now. So, I started seeing some of the challenges when I was an antitrust enforcer at the New York AG and how the antitrust laws weren't really working. But it was after I left that I was able to join kind of this movement of thinkers, really showing that the current system is not working, that our economy is becoming so highly consolidated that it's not working for most people, and that antitrust enforcement had gone missing with huge harms related to it. But I do have to give credit to the Open Markets Institute and the movement that is growing every day, getting bigger every day. But we have basically 30 years of evidence to show it's not worked. So the writing on the wall is pretty clear.
Right. So this is an issue now that's being written about in popular books, certainly in mainstream media. Can you explain a little bit about why do you think this this counter-revolution, as I'll call it, has been, sort of emerged and has been successful?
I think it's been successful because you can't ignore the problems anymore. The harms of having a highly consolidated economy are just so great. And people are struggling, and people want to figure out, how do we fix our economy? I mean, our economy right now is really only working for a select few. The 0.1% have gotten richer and richer, have more wealth than the bottom 80% of Americans. And the ability just to make a living is just so much harder than it used to be. And then we have all kinds of other harms in terms of concentrated control over speech, and how that's affected our democratic processes, like the election, harms to entrepreneurship, harms to just, the cost of healthcare. So many harms that have come out of allowing corporations to become so giant and our markets to be no longer competitive, that I think the pain is really why the movement is being successful. The evidence is just, you can't really ignore it at this point. So people always say to me, oh, are you sure anything's going to happen? Or isn't this all too complicated to do anything about it? And I always say, I'm really confident that we're going to get our markets working again and get competition working again, because we don't really have a choice. This current course is not sustainable. So I really think it's a matter of when, not if. And what we're trying to do, and I'm trying to do, is make it happen sooner by getting people to understand how this affects their daily lives, so that they can rise up and start pressuring for the government to do its job, enforce the antitrust laws and other anti-monopoly policies, so that we can have open, competitive markets again.
And so this is an issue that has certainly been taken up by progressive activists. And Elizabeth Warren, when she was a candidate for president, talked about the need to, or she argued, she said it was important to break up big tech companies. And at the time, that was pretty radical for a presidential candidate to be talking about one, antitrust, and then advocating for something like a breakup of a company. What I think is interesting, and I wanted you to talk about, was a little bit about how antitrust in this country has a history of being very political. Like a century ago, it was something that was very much on the mind of politicians, but then that changed, it seems, and it became something that was very apolitical. I think until maybe right now. Can you talk about that history and why you think it is that it sort of, well, at least in the last few decades, sort of disappeared from the political conversation?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the main reason why it disappeared from the political conversation is the same thing we were talking about before, involving the takeover of the Chicago School of Economics. Instead of it being about making sure we had fair competition, and that antitrust law was deconcentrating power, which is always what it was intended for, it became a battle of experts doing regressions and complicated economic analysis. And it became so overly complex that no average person could really talk about it or be involved in it. I think it was honestly a deliberate complication of antitrust laws. Obviously, to make it much harder to prevail against any corporation. There was, just kind of this, now to even for an antitrust enforcer to sue a big corporation, you're talking about multi-years long, multi-million-dollar often effort. So it was really in service of corporate power to make it so complicated and so difficult to prevail with all these, impossible to meet burdens, basically. So I think that was a deliberate strategy in favor of corporate power to take away this tool that really does belong to the people. Back when Senator Sherman passed the Sherman Act in 1898, he said, if we will not bear a king as a political power, then we shall not bear a king of commerce and trade. So it really is an issue of democracy and concentrated corporate power. And when we defeated the first round of robber barons that we had in this country at the original Gilded Age, it was really a citizen movement that did that. Standard Oil was a monopoly on the scale of what we have today, although not global like the ones we have today. But it was a big bad monopolist that ruled all the markets, controlled the political system, may have seemed insurmountable to overcome Standard Oil. And there was a journalist named Ida Tarbell who did investigative reporting about Standard Oil Company, exposed all of its misconduct, and published it in magazine articles that then turned into a book, actually caused a popular uprising. And I don't know if you've ever seen, they're in my book, but there were all these wonderful cartoons from the Gilded Age where they were trying to show monopoly power in these images that would be very accessible to the average person to, anger them and get them involved in the movement against monopoly. And it was only when the citizens rose up that the government did break up Standard Oil. And then it also passed the Clayton Act, which bans uncompetitive mergers, anti-competitive mergers. So I really believe the citizens must be involved. We will not overcome monopoly power unless we have an engaged citizenry, because the reality is that the concentrated economic power of monopolies translates to tremendous political power. And the only way to overcome those millions of dollars of monopoly money is through the people. So yes, it has been taken away from the people. It needs to come back from the people. This is a tool to ensure that we have equality. We have an American dream that's alive and functioning, and that we're not being ruled by corporations, both economically and politically.
And actually, so I think this would be a good time to explain how we make decisions about antitrust enforcement in this country, because it is not a decision that's made very openly or by Congress. It is a very, I think, as a journalist, secretive process. So talk about the antitrust enforcement kind of regime in the United States, and just so people understand and how that process works, and what enforcers, what their job is in terms of enforcing the law.
Sure. So in the United States, we have a few different types of antitrust enforcers. We have the Department of Justice. We have the Federal Trade Commission. And then at the state level, we have state attorneys general. They have their own antitrust laws, state antitrust laws, and they have the power to enforce the federal ones, like the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act that I mentioned before. Now, the FTC and DOJ, people can get confused about who gets what type of case. It's kind of just a matter of resources and specialization. There's not an incredibly clear distinction between which type of case goes to which agency. There's a few different ways that they go about beginning to enforce antitrust laws. There's the merger context, when large corporations have to actually notify the federal agencies when they are going to acquire a company of a certain size. And there is a certain amount of time that the agencies have to look at that merger pretty quickly and decide whether or not they're going to take a deeper look, which is called the second request, and get more documents and investigate it, or whether they think it's okay and they're just going to let the deal go through. If they do the second request, then they ask for more documents, they do, interviews and whatnot, and then they'll decide whether or not to sue to block the deal. Unfortunately, they don't just have the unilateral ability to say, okay, we've investigated this and we've determined it's anti-competitive. They have to prevail in court. They have to sue in court to block the deal, and they have to win. And unfortunately, the judges have bought into the Chicago School of Economics ideology so strongly that often it's even hard to win basic merger blocks. We saw that recently with the lawsuit against the Sprint T-Mobile merger. That's something that should have been a straightforward, a slam dunk merger block when you're talking about a horizontal merger among competitors. where they had actually shown that there was going to be billions of dollars or millions of dollars of price increases to consumers as a result of the merger. And still, the judge declined to block that deal. So that's one context, is the merger context. The second main context is the conduct context, where antitrust enforcers are looking at anti-competitive behavior. And they will find out about that either because some player in the market complains to them, or they read a news story, they get a tip, and they might decide to investigate, for example, Amazon's mistreatment of third-party marketplace sellers or something like that. And then they investigate it. And again, they have to decide, can they win in court? Because the laws have been so narrowed in terms of the legal precedent that's come out in the last 30 years, it's hard to win those cases, particularly monopolization cases. And so enforcers are always trying to decide, can we win in court? And oftentimes the answer is no, even when it is clearly anti-competitive conduct. So that's kind of the problem of why we've seen such weak enforcement. There's this calculus of, can we win in court? And increasingly the answer to that is no. I do think that enforcers should be more aggressive, should be more willing to lose, because even when you lose, you're showing Congress, hey, these laws are not working and you need to step in and fix these bad court decisions that have made the antitrust laws so toothless. But yeah, that is the process. It is quite opaque. There's not much for the average citizen to do in terms of seeing what these agencies are deciding. The investigations are confidential. But once they do sue in court, then it becomes a much more transparent process.
And so if you think that it's important for this process to be more political than it has been, how do you see going forward, or is there anything those interested in this issue can do actually to have a voice in this process? Because these investigations, you talked about the merger investigations, that can take a year. Essentially, there's no pronouncements or progress announced by the agencies when they do that. The same goes for monopolization investigations when they happen. So there doesn't seem to be much of a role, if any, for citizens to have a voice, right?
Well, I think that citizens are key to us turning around this weak antitrust enforcement that we've had, and that's the whole reason why I wrote the book, to let people know this is what monopoly rule means to you in your life when you're struggling every day and you can't pay your bills, when you're getting gouged on pharmaceuticals, when you're having conflict with the other half of America and living in a divided America. What does monopoly have to do about it? The whole reason why I wanted to let people understand what it means to their lives was so that they could get involved. So I firmly believe that citizens are key, but it may not be at the agency level. It may be in terms of pressuring Congress and their elected representatives to reform the antitrust laws. So what we don't normally do is have Congress pass laws and then let judges completely destroy those laws, okay? What we normally do is, if the judges start to destroy the laws that were democratically, passed, then the Congress needs to rein in the judges and say, no, that's not what we meant when we said you're not allowed to monopolize, we meant you're not allowed to monopolize. We didn't mean you have to prove 1,000 things you can't prove in order to win a monopoly case. So, a big role for citizens is to be involved in supporting anti-monopoly reforms at Congress, supporting those candidates who are willing to be aggressive. It's a really brave move for people like Representative Cicilline, who is in the House and heads up the Judiciary subcommittees and antitrust subcommittee of the House Judiciary, to endeavor to do an in-depth investigation of big tech and to propose all kinds of reforms that takes a lot of bravery, and we need to have his back. We need to support those lawmakers who are willing to stand up to concentrated corporate power, because there's tens of millions of dollars of monopoly money encouraging them not to do that. So that's where I think the citizen needs to be most involved. And, if Congress changes some of these really bad court decisions and makes clear that we want the antitrust laws to function, and here's how we can do it with simple, bright line rules that don't take 10 years to bring a case, and that don't require, millions of dollars of economics fees for economists, then we can start to see real change. So, that's just one part of the anti-monopoly toolkit, reforming the antitrust laws, but that's certainly a really important role for citizens to play.
So I wanted to talk about some of those recent developments because, as you've explained, you've been very critical of enforcers not doing enough. But just last month in October, the Justice Department sued Google in a monopolization case. That was the first major monopolization case in 20 years. That's a long time. So it seems that maybe the enforcers are changing and becoming more aggressive. Do you agree with that or not?
Yeah, I mean, US v. Google was a big deal, Folks criticize it as being somewhat narrow in scope. It is only getting at, the tip of the iceberg in terms of Google's anti-competitive conduct. I mean, Google has 8 products with over 1 billion users. It's constantly pulling levers to distort competition. So the DOJ's first complaint is really only getting at a fraction of that behavior, but it's still critically important that we finally have an antitrust case against a monopolist under the Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is the provision that bars monopolization. And like you said, the last main case was US v. Microsoft. That was a long time ago. I was in law school. I am a lot older than that now.
Yeah.
That was actually my introduction to antitrust law, was the US v. Microsoft. So, it's been a long time. It's a big deal that we finally turned that corner, and it's really only the beginning of what we're going to see coming against Google. And then we also have, the FTC is expected to sue Facebook in the next month or two. We're going to have state attorneys general adding to the Google case with their investigations into other aspects of Google's monopoly power and anti-competitive behavior. So no, it's a huge deal.
So why is it that it took 20 years? Google has been a huge successful company for a long time, probably that long, right? And Facebook is newer, of course. But how do you explain if monopolies are such a problem in the economy? Why would we go 20 years without a case against a big company?
Well, as I was saying before, the judges had really made it very difficult to prevail in a Sherman Act Section 2 case. Those are the ones that go after monopolization. There's another part of the Sherman Act, which is called Section 1, and that is when you have more than one company agreeing to restrain trade. So if you have a couple companies that have fixed prices and have agreed that they're going to charge the same amount to consumers. When I was working as an antitrust enforcer, most of our efforts went to those Section 1 cases because they were easy to win in court. Once you prove that there's been an agreement to restrain trade, once you prove that these companies have agreed to fix prices or to rig bids, then it's called per se illegal. It's automatically illegal and you win in court. Most of the antitrust agencies do have limited resources, and there's enough Section 1 violations going on to keep quite busy just doing that. So really Section 2 is just lower. That's the monopolization law. was lower priority. And the other thing is we also had merger mania for the last several decades. So we're basically drinking from a fire hose, as I say, of merger reviews. So it's not like antitrust enforcement was sitting around doing nothing. We're reviewing millions of mergers. We're bringing cases for price fixing. But Sherman Act Section 2, the monopolization law, just got lower priority because they are harder to win in court, because the courts had really reined it in and really narrowed it, the law's reach. So that's one of the main reasons. And again, that's the whole triumph of neoliberalism in the courts. The other thing is with Google and these big tech companies, when we're operating under this consumer welfare standard, which was the point that I was saying earlier, that the idea that we let the corporations get big, they become more efficient, and consumers benefit in the form of lower prices. That was the whole ideology behind it. And so the standard that the courts apply is this consumer welfare standard. And with a company like Google, where things seem like they're free, it was much easier for it to kind of fly under the radar than, say, if it was, a company that was gouging us all on the price of chicken or whatnot. It didn't fit well with the consumer welfare standard to go after these companies because what could be better than free, right? And so that was really how they got away with it for so long. When in reality, as I explained in the book, they're not free. We're paying with our data, we're paying with our attention, and we're paying in so many other ways as taxpayers and workers and entrepreneurs. But the currency is our data, and our data is highly valuable. Some economists even say that if you had a competitive marketplace and online, we'd be getting paid for our data. The companies would be competing to pay us on how much they should be paying us for our highly valuable data. But that's another reason why these tech companies went so long without seeing enforcement, is because of this kind of myth that they were offering free services and therefore, optimizing consumer welfare to such an extent. Although I would I just want to make the one point that US v. Microsoft wasn't actually about price increases to consumers.
Right. But at the same time, people will say, but Google is a great service. And it's just a great search engine and gets me what I need. But actually DOJ lays out some actual things that Google did that hurt the market. I think maybe we should, just as an example of how big tech, in your view, can harm competition, maybe you could sort of explain exactly what the Justice Department is alleging. It's not just really about the data, it's about actual conduct that they engaged in.
Right. So basically what the Justice Department is alleging is actually a near clone of US v. Microsoft. So what happened in US v. Microsoft, I'll just go into it really quickly, was that Microsoft had a monopoly on computer operating systems. It had 95% market share. And so it told the computer makers, if you want to sell a computer with Microsoft's operating system, well, then you have to install our apps, our software, our browser. And so it basically made it so that Netscape Navigator, which was a competing browser, had really no shot at competing. So this is the big distinction. To always ask yourself, is this competing based on merit to be the best? Or is this using muscle to kick out the other company and make sure they don't even have a shot at competing? Okay, so it wasn't Microsoft saying we're going to have better features than Netscape and therefore we're going to win. It was, we're going to make sure they don't even have a chance. There was all these hot documents, them saying these exact things. We're just going to make sure they don't even have a shot at competing. And so because computer makers didn't have a choice, they didn't have another operating system they could use to sell their computers, they had to accept Microsoft's terms and install Internet Explorer as the default browser and not Netscape Navigator. And the funny thing about this is if we hadn't brought that case against Microsoft, if the DOJ hadn't sued Microsoft, there would have been nothing to stop Microsoft from doing the exact same thing when it came to search engines, right? It could have said, everyone got our browser. We made you take our browser. You will also take our search engine. And if it were not for US v. Microsoft, we might not even have Google today. So that's the irony of this all. Google learned from Microsoft, hey, that works pretty well. And Google acquired the Android operating system. It bought that. And then it told phone makers, hey, you want our operating system? Oh yeah, there's no other real option out there. The Apple operating system is not licensable for phone makers. Then you need to take all of our apps. You need to make our apps the default. So any other company that could have been a competitor to Google in search or a whole other suite of apps, maps, video, couldn't even get to be the default in the in Android phones, which have a tremendous market share worldwide. So it really did the exact same thing, and so it used a series of exclusionary agreements to make sure that it was the default search engine for all kinds of devices, not just Android devices, but also Apple devices, and to make sure that no other company could even have the opportunity to compete. I know people say, well, Google makes this point, well, it's a lot easier to download an app these days. And I remember back in the days of Microsoft, you have to get the CD in the mail and install it. It was quite different than just going into the App Store and downloading a competitor. But so Google says, well, they just choose us. They could choose others. But the reality is Google paid, I think it was $12 billion to Apple last year to be the default. So if it was just that everyone is choosing Google, why would they need to spend $12 billion to make sure that they were chosen as that they were the default? So it's kind of a loser argument, in my opinion, on Google's part. And so anyway, it's not just that they're competing on the merits being the best, is that they were making sure that no one else had a chance to compete.
Right. You touched on this briefly, but while the Justice Department and the FTC seem to be maybe waking up from their slumber, there's also action in Congress just very recently from the Antitrust Subcommittee in the House, led by Representative David Cicilline. You mentioned him briefly, but that also is significant in the sense that I don't even know when the last time Congress took up antitrust in that way. So maybe you could talk about what that committee did in the last year and what they'll be possibly doing in the next Congress.
Yeah, the work of the committee, this is the antitrust subcommittee of the House Judiciary, led by Representative Cicilline. The work of the committee over the last 16 months is truly amazing, phenomenal, and historic. It's exactly the kind of thing that Congress should be doing all of the time, but has not done in a very long time. To me, it really restored my faith in democracy that our elected officials were willing to take on corporate power in this way, with the problems that we have of corporate lobbying and influence of money on politics. This type of really taking on powerful corporations is just such a rare sight, at least in my adult life. It was really a truly wonderful thing to see. I was honored that they invited me to testify in the very first hearing, which looked at the influence of Google and Facebook's monopoly power and duopoly power in digital advertising on the journalism industry. And then again, I got to testify at the last hearing, which was looking at proposing solutions for moving forward. So they had, many hearings over 16 months. They reviewed millions of documents, hours and hours of interviews with folks who came forward to tell their stories. And they created a 450-page report. So for anyone who doubts that these companies have behaved in an anti-competitive way, there's 450 pages for you to read. And then, of course, I talk about it in the book if you want to not read 450 pages. But it's not just that these companies are on top because they're the best. They have taken their, muscle and made sure that others don't get a chance to compete. And, that's not legal. That is illegal under the antitrust laws, and so I'm very optimistic that the proposals that Representative Cicilline has put forward in this report will start being included in legislation, and hopeful that we'll be able to make some real, reform in terms of, it's the antitrust laws. It's encouraging things like interoperability so that entrepreneurs and other upstarts can be compatible with some of these infrastructure, some of these essential infrastructure that these companies control. It's also, having non-discrimination rules, which are similar to what we had with net neutrality, to ensure that everyone that has to deal with these companies, which is nearly every major business, is treated on the same terms. So there's a lot of aspects to it. It's not just about strengthening the antitrust laws, but it's incredibly, wonderful to see. And it is really a historic turning point right now in our democracy, and especially regarding, going after the tech platforms, of course.
Yeah, so the report describes the tech companies, and it focused on Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. Basically described them as gatekeepers, right, in the economy. And so in all their different markets, it basically said that each company in its own way is choking off competition, whether through mergers or other conduct. And actually, though, the recommendations go beyond just tech. I mean, we talked earlier in the conversation about the focus on prices. The report's recommendations, one of them is to sort of, in my view, kind of rewrite or throw out that framework of antitrust right now and consider in enforcement decisions a much broader set of considerations, like effects on workers and small businesses, that sort of thing. I don't know if that will go anywhere, but I mean, do you see it as something, a blueprint or whatever that could change enforcement more significantly than just in tech?
Oh, definitely. And all of us in the anti-monopoly movement were like, great job. Now do every other sector of the economy. But some of the changes could certainly impact every sector of the economy. If we get back to what antitrust law was supposed to be about, which is promoting competition, then a lot of the harms that flow from allowing these monopolies to rule will go away. So, there's a kind of a difference between saying we're going to consider all these other factors in our analysis, or, the way that I look at it is that once we start enforcing the antitrust laws as intended, which is just to promote competition, we will get all of these other benefits that flow from having open competitive markets. So workers will benefit because, workers are better off when they have many different possible employers to choose from. I have a whole chapter in the book about how wages have been depressed, how workers and employees of all kinds have taken a smaller and smaller share of the productivity and the value that they create as our economy has gotten more and more consolidated. And the bargaining power that workers have, is so much less when there are only a few main competitors in each sector. We've seen wage stagnation, and I think anti-monopoly has a huge part of that. And if you're not an employee, maybe you're an entrepreneur, and then you're being denied opportunities to compete because you're blocked out of so many markets, or you're squashed if you challenge a dominant company. So, all of these benefits to workers, to entrepreneurship, to, deconcentrating speech, to me, they all flow from ensuring that our markets are competitive. So you don't actually have to say, we're focused on speech. Just you make the markets competitive, we'll have speech benefits because we'll have less concentrated control over speech. So obviously to the extent we're able to reform antitrust law across the board, we will see benefits in agriculture, pharmaceuticals, right? We'll see benefits across the board if we reform antitrust laws to actually promote competition, which is what they're intended to do.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about tech. I did want to ask you about another industry. You write, there's a chapter in the book about healthcare, many examples of some problematic conduct in healthcare. I thought that just as an example, you might be able to talk a little bit about Mylan, which is the maker. This is a product many people will be familiar with, the maker of EpiPen, the allergy medication. So they did a lot you describe in the book, to sort of keep their hold on that market. Can you talk about Mylan?
Sure. And I think, Mylan is an important example for a couple different reasons. One thing is that when we're all being gouged on prices for pharmaceuticals and essential, medical care and equipment, we don't often think about monopoly power. I think the average person thinks, okay, this is our messed up healthcare system. We do have a lot of problems in our healthcare system, but if we reined in the actual violations of antitrust law by big pharma, I can guarantee you we would get billions of dollars back. We would really trim our healthcare costs because it's rampant. I mean, it is. I spent most of my time at the New York State AG's office just focused on healthcare because it was just like playing whack-a-mole every time that it makes business sense for these big pharmaceutical companies to violate the antitrust laws because the fines that they pay are not as much as the gains that they make. I mean, that's a basic criticism for antitrust enforcers, right? Like if a company makes billions of dollars breaking the law, don't fine them millions of dollars, right? Then it's just, okay, cool, I'll do that again. That worked out. So with Mylan, the one point I was saying is that, it shows how monopoly leads to higher prices. We pay, in America, EpiPens cost on average $600. In France, I think they're $60. The other important point about Mylan is how when you allow markets to become concentrated, you get shortages. And that has been a critical issue with the COVID pandemic. People need to understand how much the monopolization of our economy made us, as I like to say, sitting ducks in the face of COVID-19 because we did not have enough of anything because all of our supply chains were so consolidated. When you have two companies in the world making swabs that are needed for testing, okay, that's a monopoly problem, right? And that's what we've seen with EpiPens, which Mylan makes. The EpiPens that every child with peanut allergies or life-threatening allergies needs to have constantly are often just not available. There's shortages. And parents who are like, if my kid's in school and someone eats a peanut butter sandwich next to them and they could die and I can't get the medicine because it's not available. Well, how is that possible that we have shortages? Mylan did so much anti-competitive conduct to make sure that there will be no other epinephrine injectors on the market. That not only can it charge $600 in the U.S., but it also can make sure that there's no other options available when it runs out. You wrote about how they took steps to make sure competitors didn't get into schools. Right. This is all I should say so that I don't get sued. These are all allegations in a complaint by a competitor to Mylan, and I have not personally seen these documents, but they're all in a complaint by Sanofi, another pharmaceutical company that was trying to come out with a competing injector. And what Mylan said to schools was, if you want the discounted price that we're giving to schools, then you can't stock any other type of injector. Obviously, budget-strapped schools have no choice to say no to that situation, and especially when the EpiPen is the dominant injector out there that most people know how to use and whatnot. They have to kind of make sure that they stock that. So it actually took steps to make sure that schools didn't have the alternatives available to them. And this was after Mylan spent lots of money lobbying to require all schools to have EpiPens in the first place. So there was a period in time when Mylan had the most lobbyists at the state level. It grew the most lobbyists at the state level than any other corporation at a particular period of time, when they were making sure that it was required by law that these EpiPens were available, which doesn't seem like a bad thing. But then to say, and only our EpiPens, only our injectors. So it creates, when you have these big pharma companies doing anti-competitive conduct to make sure that there are not other competitors on the market, we get shortages and we get overpriced drugs. The other main way that we see it is with something that's called pay to delay. It's literally pharmaceutical companies paying generic drug companies not to introduce their generic drugs. I always said I should have been a generic drug manufacturer. Talk about a great job, right? You just get paid to do nothing. Millions of dollars.
There are many other examples in the book. The whole chapter, we won't have time to get into it, but hospital consolidation is another issue that actually enforcers have been pretty active around. But at the same time, people watching this will know that in many communities, there's generally one or maybe two hospitals, typically controlled by large companies. And that means higher prices when we get sick, because there's only one choice.
Right. So it means higher prices when we get sick. It also means bed shortages, right? With COVID, when we had a huge crisis of not enough hospital beds, that was because we had, reductions of beds over the last decade in tremendous number. I forget the exact statistic, but it's in the book. Also, the other side of that is it leads to depressed wages for healthcare workers. There was economists that estimated that nurses should be getting paid far more than they're currently getting paid. And the reason why they're not is because they have, monopoly employers. And so they don't have bargaining power. Their bosses are not competing. Their employers are not competing to hire them. And so their wages have really been depressed by the monopolization of hospital systems. So it affects you as a worker. It affects you as a patient. It affects you as someone, and it affects your pocketbook. So those are some of the ways that affects you on a daily basis and causes a lot of the pain points that we all have in our daily lives.
So in the few minutes we have left, I did want to ask you about, we're about to change administrations, and I wanted to get your prediction on what you think, how these issues you think will be handled by a Biden administration and the next Congress.
Yeah, so I think it's a little hard to tell what's going to happen with the Biden administration. I think once we get the appointments in terms of who's heading up the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, and we see who's in charge making the decisions, we'll have a better sense of that. That makes a big difference. I think there will not be any kind of a rolling back of what the DOJ has done so far. The Google case that the DOJ has brought is not any kind of an innovative or boundary pushing case. Like I said, it's a clone of US v. Microsoft, which is still good law. So it's not a case that I expect to be curbed in any way by the Biden administration. I do think there's increasing pressure on the Biden administration to take action. I think the Biden administration experienced the dangers of concentrated control over speech when we saw every little decision that Facebook made leading up to the election having huge impact on the campaign's reach and the flow of disinformation, and often really benefiting the Trump campaign. I mean, there was a study by the Markup showing that the Trump campaign actually paid less per ad than the Biden campaign did. And that was because its ads performed better, which means are more likely to cause people to make a reaction. That's what Facebook's business model is programmed to do, get people to react. So content that causes fear or anger is actually favored content by Facebook's business model, and they actually boost disinformation and misinformation. So I would expect that the Biden administration would have an appetite to encourage or ensure that our marketplace of ideas is robust, that we can have a public sphere of debate again, instead of having each person getting their own targeted, individualized stream of content that we don't even actually see the same speech that each other is seeing. I think still be, a lot of evidence coming out in the next few months showing how much disinformation influenced this election and was boosted by both Facebook and YouTube. So I expect that, that problem is going to continue to get attention. So I think we're going to continue to have robust, this new movement is going to continue. I'm very optimistic, but like I said, I would like to see who he appoints to know for sure.
And what do you foresee in the next Congress, if anything? At this point, we don't know whether the Senate will be controlled by Democrats, but if Republicans hold control, do you see any movement there?
Yeah, so antitrust is actually one of the very few bipartisan issues, in our country right now. So I actually think that anti-monopoly is one way that we could try to start Unite America. I think folks on both sides of the aisle realize this is a problem and can agree. Some of the more aggressive opponents to monopoly power are on the right. So it's not necessarily the case that, a Democrat or Republican, influences directly anti-monopoly policy. And in fact, it's kind of like what kind of Democrat and what kind of Republican. So I'm optimistic that, the reforms that Cicilline has proposed will start to get more traction. I know there's other lawmakers like, obviously Senator Warren, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Blumenthal, Hawley, Booker. We have a lot of different folks who are really focused on these issues right now. So I do think we will see legislative reform. Even when Cicilline's report came out, the Republicans led by Ken Buck put out a memo that said that they did agree with nearly all of the findings of the report. And I think they actually agreed with all of the findings and just disagreed with some of the remedies, some of the proposed remedies. So I do think we will see change. It's just a question of, how aggressive it'll be depending on, and I have not yet had time to figure out exactly who's taken seats to see if they're anti-monopoly or not quite yet.
Okay, well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you, Sally Hubbard, author of Monopolies Suck: 7 Ways Big Corporations Rule Your Life and How to Take Back Control. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, David.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Send us an email at podcasts@c-span.org.